All right, so in this video lecture now, we're going to talk more about how the force of contraction by your skeletal muscles is controlled. And some of this I've been alluding to already, so some of it will be review, tying some of these things together. Oh, come on. Okay, so I actually mentioned this on the last video clip. So we already know that a whole skeletal muscle is divided up into many different motor units. So there are a whole bunch of motor neurons that control a typical skeletal muscle. Okay, and so some of those motor units are going to respond to less stimulus from the brain, because remember, the brain stimulates the motor neurons, which stimulate your skeletal muscle fibers. And in general, the more stimulus that the brain sends to the motor neurons that control the skeletal muscle, the more motor units will wind up being recruited. Okay, so you're going to have more motor neurons firing action potentials down to the muscle fibers they control. Then you're going to have more muscle fibers in that muscle contracting. That just makes sense. And so the brain is very good at controlling all of this, controlling your contraction force. And so it does that by controlling its recruitment. So it knows if you need to generate a delicate movement within a skeletal muscle, the brain is going to stimulate smaller motor units. If you need to make a bulkier movement, the brain up here is going to stimulate more and more and more motor units until you can generate the maximum amount of force that you can across that whole muscle. Size principle plays a role here as well. And this just kind of sounds like common sense. Muscle fibers are not all the same size. So muscle cells, some of them will be skinnier and others will be wider. And as you might imagine, your wider muscle fibers, again, here we're talking about individual cells within a muscle. Some are going to be smaller, some are going to be bigger. And as you might imagine, the larger fibers are going to generate a stronger force of contraction. The smaller, wimpier ones are going to generate a lesser force or lower force of contraction. So the brain is going to recruit motor units that involve these bigger, thicker muscle cells when you need to generate stronger contractions. Okay, so this is a pretty nice little graphic from your textbook, which is showing what happens here. And so up here on the top, we've got stimulus strength, and this is actually stimulation from the brain. Stylus does not want to write here. This is coming from the brain. So you have neurons up here in the brain. They're firing action potentials that travel down from the brain to the spinal cord. We'll learn more about that in Unit 5, that are stimulating motor neurons. So you think back to when we went over the action potential story, we talked about how motor neurons receive signals from other neurons, and then you start to get some depolarization going on in there. The stimulation opens some sodium channels, sodium comes in, and that's what we really mean by stimulus. Okay, so as the brain is sending these stimulations to the motor neurons, this stimulation can be measured in different amounts of voltage, kind of referring to the strength or the power of the stimulation. And what they're trying to show you down here is that as you get more and more and more and more stimulation from the brain, you get more and more and more motor units within that skeletal muscle excited. They're becoming excited. That means that they generate the muscle fibers do excitation contraction coupling. So what they're showing you here at first, if you look here, when you have low amounts of stimulation coming from the brain, and this is supposed to be like a cross section within a muscle. This is sort of, we're looking at some imaginary motor units here. You don't have any motor units functioning within that muscle. But then eventually you reach enough stimulation, some sort of threshold. There's enough stimulation coming from the brain, enough motor neurons start responding that you start contracting some muscle fibers within that muscle. And then as you get more and more and more stimulation happening, you wind up recruiting more and more and more motor units. So in here, these are going to be, this is representing motor units recruited down in here. And eventually you're going to get to some maximal amount of stimulation coming from the brain, and that's going to lead to maximal contraction. So this is going to be your tension across the whole skeletal muscle. And so you can see how this progresses along the timeline here. At first, you're going to have those smaller motor units. They get recruited the easiest and the earliest. So at first, the contraction force within the muscle is fairly weak. But then within less than a second, you can reach your maximal contraction state as more and more and more of those motor units wind up getting recruited. Okay, and here's another look at what happens with the changes in tension across a whole skeletal muscle as you get more and more and more motor units recruited. Now here we've got kind of a pretend muscle, and we're thinking about, well, what if that whole muscle was just divided up into 3 motor units? So that's what they're trying to show you here in this graphic. Motor unit number 1 gets recruited first, so it needs the least amount of stimulation from the brain, but it just involves a lower number of muscle cells that it's stimulating to contract, and maybe they're smaller, they don't generate as much force. But then you continue with more powerful stimulation coming from the brain, and now you've recruited motor unit number 1 and number 2. So you're going to add in that additional contraction force from the second motor unit. Maybe these are medium-sized fibers. And then if you keep sending more and more stimulation from the brain, eventually you're going to recruit motor unit number 3 here. And so now 1, 2, and 3 are going to be contributing. Their muscle fibers are all going to be contracting, and that's going to increase your force. This is a summation of forces. So with more stimulation coming from the brain, you actually summate or add up the contraction forces from those 3 motor units. Okay, so just to kind of review some things that can, and there are some a new concept in here as well that we'll talk about. How do you increase contractile force within a muscle? One way is to activate a large number of muscle cells, muscle fibers. The more muscle fibers that are undergoing contraction, the greater the contraction force across your whole muscle. That makes sense. Also, you can stimulate larger muscle fibers. So within a skeletal muscle, you can have bigger muscle fibers, muscle cells, and skinnier ones. The bigger ones are going to have more myofibrils. Okay, so the bigger ones have more myofibrils, which means they've got more actin and myosin filaments inside to do cross-bridging, so they're going to be able to generate stronger contraction forces. The other thing you can do is more frequent stimulation. So you can have more powerful stimulation coming from the brain, and then motor neurons can send out their action potentials with greater frequency. That's going to lead to greater contraction force. As we saw, you're going to stair step upward, but eventually you're going to reach some peak contraction force. All right, and then here's something that we haven't talked about yet, and that is if your skeletal muscle and the sarcomeres inside that skeletal muscle before the muscle starts contracting, if they're pre-stretched a little bit, just slightly over 100% of the typical length of that muscle, that can actually increase the contraction force. All right, so what in the world do we mean by that? Okay, so we've got another graph here that we're taking a look at. So over here on the left, this is going to be the percentage of maximum possible tension within a muscle. And then we're graphing that there on the blue line. Now on the x-axis here, this is percent of your resting sarcomere length. So here we're thinking about your whole muscle. And think about like your biceps brachii muscle having a normal length when it's relaxed, not dealing with any kind of load. It's going to have kind of a typical length to it. And all right, that's what they're showing you here in the middle. And so you don't have cross bridging taking place at this time. The muscle is relaxed, but you can kind of see there your actins and your myosins. Even at rest, they're going to be overlapping each other so that they can cross bridge when needed. So there's going to be some typical length of your sarcomeres at rest. Okay. Now, if you slightly stretch out your sarcomeres, all right, so let's think about if you slightly increase the stretch. All right, so 100% would be normal. And look at like 120% over here. So think about your biceps brachii muscle. If this is its normal length, and let's say, now not due to contraction, it's not contracting, it's just lengthened a little bit. What's going to happen to your actins and your myosins? All right, so if under a normal state they're like this, if you pre-stretch the muscle before it contracts, actins and myosins might separate a little bit more like this. Okay, well guess what's going to happen then when they do start cross-bridging, when they're contracting, they have more distance that they can slide across each other. They can do a greater amount of sliding. The more sliding they do, the greater the force that they generate. So that's what they're showing you here. You get a little bit, as you go above 100%, you can get a little bit of an increase in the strength of a contraction. Think about like if you're holding a dumbbell. If you pick up a dumbbell and you're holding it down like this, you're actually going to be able to generate a stronger force than if you started more like this with your elbow. And it's maybe easier to think about when sarcomeres are greatly shortened over here. So what's going to happen there? If your biceps brachii muscle was more compressed before you picked up a weight, okay, then your actin and your myosins, they're not cross-bridging yet, but they're already going to be overlapping more like this. So when they do start cross-bridging, they don't have as much distance to slide across each other. So you're not going to be able to generate as much force within that muscle. So that's what they're showing. That can drop down as low as 60%. Now imagine if you had your elbow like this before you started picking up a heavy weight, you had your elbow flexed. You're not going to be able to hold as much weight. You're not going to be able to hold as heavy of a dumbbell if you start off with your elbow flexed as if you had your elbow more extended. Okay, now what about if you have your sarcomeres excessively stretched? So let's say you were down, like 160, 180% of normal. So like what if you had your arm all the way extended out like this and then you tried to pick up a heavy weight? That's not going to work too well either, because what happens is your actin and your myosin filaments, some of them won't be even overlapping at all. If you stretch out the sarcomeres and the muscle fiber far enough, they may not overlap. They may not be able to cross bridge. Some of them still will be able to, but some of them may be so stretched apart that they can't even make cross bridges with each other. And so that winds up affecting the strength of your muscle contraction as well. Another example of that we've all experienced, you guys know that if you are walking up a flight of stairs. And to do that, you've got to activate your hamstring muscles to help you with your hip movements that allow you to walk upstairs. And so you guys know if you try to take 2 stairs at once, it's a whole lot more difficult to do that than taking 1 stair at once. So your gluteus maximus muscles are getting involved in that as well. And so what happens when you take 2 stairs at once, you're excessively stretching some of your sarcomeres. It makes it more difficult to contract the hamstrings, contract the gluteus maximus muscle to help you extend the hip and pull yourself up to the next step. So that's another example of that as well. All right, so lecture 15. So we've been talking about some of our muscle mechanics here and different things that affect the force of contractions and the duration of contractions. And where do muscles get all their energy? So this is going to get back a little bit into cellular respiration. I told you guys this was going to come back when we got to Unit 4 and started talking about muscles. So we're going to, muscles need a lot of ATP in order to function. And so they've got some special things that they can do to make sure that they have enough ATP or can keep producing ATP and using ATP as long as possible to help you with your muscle contraction. So we'll talk about that in the next video lecture.